Welcome to Let's H. I'm your host, Hushcho, and today we are here with American Horror Story Apocalypse, Do's and Don'ts, things that I'm hopeful that producer Ryan Murphy will be able to do or not to do in the upcoming season, but which I'm pretty sure are just things that I would like to see or like to not see that he may or may not do regardless. I'm pretty sure I'll be disappointed, but I'll still probably watch at least for Joan Collins and the possibility of seeing some of my favorite witches again. If you like what I do, follow me on Patreon. Plenty of great extras and bonuses there, and I really do appreciate the support. So, without further ado, let's go to the do's and don'ts of American Horror Story Apocalypse. Do: bring back beloved characters permanently. You've visited these settings before. Most especially in the Coven season, it dealt a lot with characters dying and coming back from the dead. Quite a lot, actually. So much that it made it seem like the ending was even more bullshit than it actually was. So what you need to do is bring back those characters and leave them alone. These are the characters that made those seasons. These are the characters that are interesting, that we were tuning in to see. And you know, the Murder House characters, those can stay as ghosts or whatever, because that was what that season revolved around. Most of what Murder House was about ghosts anyway. So, leave those characters ghosts, but at least give us the witches back. Don't rehash what the series Salem did, because let me tell you, the series Salem, which was all about witches, and riding on the wave of popularity of witches at the time, had what is essentially a child devil. Satan character, an antichrist if you will. Don't rehash that. Salem did it, and it was okay for what it was, but it doesn't need to be done again American Horror Story style. Do use your most beloved actors in roles worthy of them. Myrtle Snow was possibly the best witch in Coven, at least if personal opinions matter. Frances Conroy has rarely been used in a role that suits her ever since. Her role as Dandy's mother was great, but she ended up being eclipsed by Dandy, who for some reason the script thought was more interesting than Frances Conroy trading barbs with Elsa Mars. We're still a bit confused about that, but her laughably awful casting in Roanoke just made the whole reality show atmosphere seem even more ridiculous. Don't do that again. Get Frances Conroy back and put her in the role of Myrtle Snow. There's also Moira from the first season, who was magnificent. On this same note, there are plenty of other actors in the ensemble cast that have better roles that they could be playing than some of the roles that they might be playing. For example, Tate from Murder House was way more interesting than Frankenbro from Coven, and you're gonna want to have Evan Peters for the entire season. So whether he's the grown-up Antichrist baby, or Tate, or Frankenbro, or all three, use the people that you have in roles that will actually suit them. You've been doing this for very close to 10 years. You should be able to know what they can handle, what they can't, and what roles they excel in. Concentrate on that. Don't dwell on politics. It's already been done, and it's done in almost every Antichrist story. Just about every story wants to be The Omen, or Rosemary's Baby, or something like that. Every cheap knockoff of the 666 formula dabbles in politics and does a really bad job. Last year's Cult was not the most successful American Horror Story and in fact had pretty low ratings compared to the other seasons. Let's not go right back into that rabbit hole. Do something new and different with that story. I know that a lot of what American Horror Story does is it takes established tropes, even cliches sometimes, and tries to put them together in a different way. That's how a lot of stories function. But if you look at even something like Coven, for example, it was obviously inspired by Lucio Fulci's The Beyond in many, many aesthetic moments, not to mention plenty of other things like Myrtle Snow's obvious nod to The Dressmaker. It's great to combine things in a creative manner, so be creative. Do something different with that idea. Don't just get caught up in the easy thing that everybody else has done and dial it in like you do on some of the seasons. It's easy to do, but it also won't keep an audience. Do concentrate on the stronger veteran actors. Some of the previous series didn't concentrate enough on the older cast that it had. These tended to be the stronger actors of the cast. Don't be afraid to dwell on their story more than the pretty young things that populate the rest of it. Ultimately, we're not there for some flaccid romance between two people that don't really have any chemistry, and two actors that would be better used in different roles. I'm looking at you, Zoe and Frankenbro. You had no chemistry between you, and the only thing that made that interesting was Madison in the middle. It's nothing short of a tragedy to see fantastic actors, like Angela Bassett, for example, cast in roles that are barely more than cameos every few episodes. It's also terrible to see ensemble staples, like Evan Peters or Lily Rabe, in one-shot roles, and they're never seen for the rest of the entire season. Don't do this! We're not tuning in to see our beloved actors and characters just basically put in cameos and then never appear again. Don't do away with beloved characters in stupid ways, like the original Coven did. One of the biggest complaints about how that season ended up was the stupid, needless way it wasted so many of its characters. There were barely any of them left by the end, and it was always in dumb ways that didn't really make narrative sense most of the time. The entire last episode is a better viewing experience if you shut it off after the surreal, bizarre music video opening. And as I've said before in previous videos, a lot of seasons of American Horror Story do this. They start off with a premiere that is generally pretty solid, but as you get past that premiere, it's like sequels to the original movie that get more and more distant from that original movie and its quality. By the end of it, it's something that has nothing to do with anything and barely functions within the coherency of its own continuity. Don't do that. If you're going to do away with a character, it should have some meaning. It should actually be significant in the narrative and make some sort of narrative sense. It should also have an impact and not just be something incidental or something that's immediately glossed over and never addressed again. Like, for example, Nan's death. I know sometimes it's a lot to keep track of so many characters, but it's better to keep a lot of characters in the air and maybe not concentrate on them every episode than it is to keep getting rid of characters constantly in stupid ways, because that doesn't really add to the horror. It just makes the audience less likely to invest any emotion in them. When it's basically just somebody getting offed every week, and in stupid ways, eventually the audience just stops caring. Who cares at this point? Who cared by the end of the series of Coven? It was a stupid ending and we knew it was going to be stupid, but we had absolutely no investment left by the end. On the contrary, in Murder House, it was much more of a consistent investment. You at least had characters that had lasted out the series for the most part, but you also had them dealing a lot with ghosts, death, and what comes after. It was a more interesting examination of that sort of thing, whereas in Coven, there was a lot of a revolving door feel, very superhero comic booky. It's one of the reasons why I always said that Coven was basically just X-Men with witches, because in fact it was basically X-Men with witches. Do give Joan Collins the opportunity to bring the cast together. Without Jessica Lange, and I will say it's probably pretty unlikely she's going to reprise her roles, we're going to need Joan Collins to bring the cast together. We cannot look at any of the ensemble cast currently there to bring the cast together. They just can't do it. I like many of the actors in the show, but unless you're going to get someone who can bring the cast together in the same way that Jessica Lange could, you're not going to manage to accomplish it. Joan Collins, as a veteran actress, has the potential to do that, but only if she's given the opportunity to do that. Do what you did with Murder House. Do what you did with all of the series after that Jessica Lange was in. She had many scenes with many of the characters, and good or bad, positive or negative, she brought out things in the other characters due to her interactions with them and developed them meaningfully as characters. This is important. This is what keeps people tuning in every week. And it's especially important when you're trying to build and maintain a level of suspense, as well as a level of emotional and mental investment in the story, the characters, and of course, the horror. Please give Joan Collins the ability to bring together a cast, because you literally have nobody else that's able to do that on the cast presently. Don't waste time with characters that are meaningless and don't contribute anything to the story. Frustrating characters especially. Don't waste time with characters like, for example, Cordelia or Zoe. I have seen the actors do better in other things. I have seen both of them excel even in other seasons of American Horror Story. In Coven, however, they were both difficult to like, bland at best, annoying as hell at worst. Cordelia getting backhanded by Fiona was absolutely the best part of the episode it happened in, because it happened to be the stupid Stevie Nicks cameo episode. Which is another minor don't. Don't put meaningless cameos into your show and try and revolve the plot around them. It's stupid and embarrassing, and it's almost immediately dated. Regardless, these are not characters that can really accomplish anything in terms of narrative unless you give them the opportunity to do that. They were not given any such opportunity, and when they are treated harshly by other characters, ultimately we as the audience do not care. And, in Cordelia's case, we are often cheering on people that treat them that way. When Cordelia was pimp-slapped by Fiona, she freaking deserved it. She basically caused the death of countless people through her ignorance and idiocy, and all for what? A cheap act of rebellion against her mother, whom she hated and blamed for all of her faults, despite the fact that it wasn't her fault? That maybe Cordelia should have looked at herself for fault? But that never came through in the narrative. That was never a lesson that we were taught, or which was imparted to us by the narrative. Ultimately, by the end of it, it's acted like Cordelia is being rewarded for what? For being possibly the worst headmistress that Miss Robichaud's Academy has ever had? The worst Supreme? And I'm talking about Supreme. Like, even if Fiona fucked off for as many years as she did and didn't take it seriously, she's still a better Supreme than Cordelia could ever be. And on that note, we also need consistency in character actions as well as plot developments, because tying to Cordelia, her decision to go public with witches is probably going to factor into the new show. But in just the previous episode, and earlier in that same episode, it was treated as this horrible thing if Madison somehow revealed the existence of witches to people. This was not adequately covered as to why it is different somehow to go public and not good to go public. I don't quite get that, because it was not in fact well written. Do put characters together with others that suit or even challenge them. Examples of this are Queenie and Nan, Madison and Zoe, Myrtle and Fiona. In some cases, these are actors that do better with someone to feed off of, with chemistry. And in other cases, it's just that they're two fantastic actors that we want to see interact with each other. Queenie and Nan, as sort of a prime example, are two very talented and able actors who were better when their characters were together. Getting rid of Nan kind of changed that relationship considerably, and making Queenie irrationally strike out on her own for questionable reasons just made her seem like more of an asshole. When they tried to sort of rebuild her character towards the end, it was a little bit too late, and having her on her own didn't work as well as when she was interacting with Nan regularly. Sometimes it takes a character to interact with to benefit both characters and to make them develop more meaningfully. In a similar way, Violet and Tate in Murder House actually have interesting chemistry and interesting interactions. In Coven, the same actors are in vastly different characters and have very little chemistry. There's a stretch where, when Madison is actually involved as a third party in their relationship, it actually gets interesting, because it shakes up the dynamic that by that point is tired and expected, and involves something new and different in it. But that, too, is quickly brushed under the rug, and it devolves into primetime soap opera antics that, likewise, don't compel and don't make sense. Be careful about who you put characters together with, because sometimes they don't work together, and sometimes they're not good together. Even Queenie and Madison had a kind of relationship that was interesting to see them interact. Zoe, on the other hand, was basically a cabbage-headed newcomer that the audience was supposed to look to whenever they needed an explanation, because she didn't know shit from Shinola. as such, she didn't really have much of a personality, and while I can say that the actress's portrayal was not particularly compelling, she also didn't have a lot to work with. It takes, as I've said many times before, an actor that can kind of pull something out of nothing. Jessica Lange was that kind of actor. Many of the regular cast are not. They just have to do their best with what they're given, which doesn't always involve the ability to pull something from something that is not really there. It takes an actor with a certain gift. Jessica Lange had that gift. Billy Zane is another actor that has this gift. Oftentimes these sorts of actors, when you watch them on the screen, they can't help but be interesting because they're giving so much extra that you know isn't on the page. It isn't in the script. It isn't specifically written down for them to do, or to internalize, or to express as their characters, but they do it anyway. They give you a consummate, holistic picture of a person as this character who seems to be a real person, living, breathing, and above all thinking before they do anything, or even before they say anything. This is something that seems consistent with this character as a person, because it is this person internalizing that and expressing it through themselves. Characters should be carefully handled so that you can get the characters together that bring forth a response from each other, and whether it's developing the character, or causing some sort of conflict, or just moving the plot. Characters need to have some reason to interact, and they also need to have something between them that comes out every time they do interact. Don't bring back terrible presentation of deities, spirits, or anything else. The prime example of this that I can cite is the guy I call not Papa Legba. Because he was not Papa Legba. He had no real reason to be in the story, and he had even less reason to interact with everybody that he did in the story, because ultimately his involvement was pointless, and it didn't make any sense. Take away all his scenes, and there's basically nothing lost. In fact, it's better for taking away those scenes. He was poorly written, he was not the best portrayed, and he didn't really add anything to the narrative. He just constantly took things away. Why exactly was it that we couldn't have, for example, demons in the story? Even if you were going to do the whole battle between the races, battle between the sexes stuff, this sort of yin-yang dynamic that we had in Coven, as poorly as it was done, why couldn't we have had something to contrast that not Papa Legba guy? But we didn't. We didn't have anything like that. He was the only basically divine personality that was involved in it. And it presented far more questions than it answered. Don't do that again. If you're going to do something that is that ethereal and that massive of an establishment of divine beings or super beings or what have you, you have to do it more holistically, in a more broad sense, and better than Coven did. Don't bring back that character, and if you have them involved in any sort of higher power, have them be off-screen. It'll be better for the budget, and it'll be far more effective. Do have Evan Peters' characters hook up. No, I know what you're thinking, but audiences have not seen enough of Evan Peters in good roles. And to be honest, Tate and Frankenbro both got the short end of the stick. Frankenbro was treated pretty badly by pretty much everyone. And he really just got fucked over, and not in the good way, ever. Tate, well, who knows? I mean, Tate is one of those characters that's very polarizing. A lot of people find it difficult to sympathize with him, others find it way too easy to sympathize with him. He's a character, he's complex, he's very complicated and was portrayed compellingly and in an engaging way. So why not have Tate and Frankenbro get together? I think that would be nice. It would be funny. It would be funny, especially since Frankenbro being who and what he is, especially in terms of like the whole life and death thing, and Tate being who and what he is, and ghosts being what they are in the American Horror Story universe. I just can see that being a really interesting and potentially kind of hilarious dynamic, and it would give them both not really so much a happy ending, but it would keep them both occupied and not doing horrible things that they could sometimes get up to when they weren't being occupied. There's an idea. I think it's one of the best ideas in the history of American Horror Story. You're welcome. Don't make this a meaningless battle of the sexes, races, or whatever. Coven's weakest moments were when it seemed to forget about what the nature was of any of these things. There were so many weird claims about this or that for witches and voodoo, and I know that this wasn't necessarily supposed to be real-world setting, and that it's largely magical, quote-unquote, realism, but when you can't write something like that well, it ends up feeling very offensive at worst and just not compelling at best. It especially fails to work since witches are not all or even mostly women. Witches historically were never that. In fact, witchcraft is about balance. So you would think there would be more of a balanced presentation. And if you're not gonna be into that, yeah, this is a fictionalized version of witches. But you have to commit or not. You can't just halfway do it. You can't, for example, have Leslie Jordan as one of the members of the Witches' Council and then be like, oh, well, this is a school for girls, so I guess all the boys are out of luck. Like, it doesn't work like that. Besides which, you know that a lot of your audience is going to want to see more male witches anyway. So balance it out. Do something like that. You don't need to have it be this weird, imbalanced, us versus them, whatever dynamic. Because so often that doesn't work very well. And it seems forced and contrived, especially in Coven, when you see how the story will develop, and then it'll go backwards, like a glacier or something. And I can think of very few better examples than the relationship that was sort of slowly built between Queenie and Delphine, which was then quickly rolled back as if we couldn't have a horrible character have positive character development even if it was interesting. You had a great actress there, portraying a horrible character who had done awful things but was developing in a far better direction. Why is it that we suddenly had to roll that back and then not have that for the entire rest of the series while both characters floundered for lack of anything interesting to do? Because they wanted to have that artificial battle between this and that, us versus them. Not a good idea when you have better things that you could have dwelt on instead of throwing out the most interesting things you had going on in favor of a contrived artificial conflict that you don't even write well. Do give more agency to the witches. In Coven, frankly, they didn't have any agency up until Fiona decided that she was damn well gonna take agency, which made it seem kind of ridiculous, even if it was very satisfying, when in basically the span of a couple of days and an afternoon, she put an end to the witch hunters. Before that, the witches were struggling to survive. Cordelia's ineptitude is obvious here, and yet we were supposed to see her as some sort of capable, commanding personality by the end, who obviously could handle it. But she couldn't, otherwise she would have done so before now. She was basically an airheaded loser that couldn't manage to concentrate on even corralling her students, much less actually doing the duty of a supreme. All she ever did was whine about her mother, not spend any time around the students, nor actually watch them, just in case they got in danger. She didn't even eat with them. And usually whenever the witches did anything, it wasn't because they had agency to act, it was because the script needed to move in some direction, so obviously the main characters were going to have to do it. This time, they need more agency to actually be able to do things. They need to be real actors in the roles. More often than not, Coven portrayed them as victims, and while the arguable contrivance for witches being so few these days was, well, debatable, it did give them a sort of a desperation, but with that desperation should have come a need to act, a need to do things, an urgency that the story simply didn't have in it. They need to have more ability to affect the story, and furthermore, to affect their lives. Don't get people for meaningless cameos. I'm looking at you, Stevie Nicks. There didn't need to be an episode where they literally worked in a guest star cameo into not only the episode, but the episode title. It was embarrassing, instantly dated, and just overall really bad. The only good thing about that episode was that was the one where Fiona slaps Cordelia finally. After that, there's not a lot that is worth seeing. Cameos don't really help. Just like stunt casting isn't a good idea. Don't just bring people into a show because you think people are going to watch and say, oh, look, I see a real celebrity from the real world. Oh, that's funny. Because it's not. And they won't, unless they're idiots. Do involve the demons barely mentioned in Coven. And although I said earlier, I think it would be best if all of this stuff takes place off-screen and saves you some budget, saves you some casting the characters, if you're going to do it upright. Make them sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Make them absolutely the most impactful visions and entities that you see. Because we had this stuff in the first couple of episodes of Coven. We had it in a ritual spell, we had name dropped. We had stuff like that was never really delivered in the rest of Coven because they wanted to focus more, for some reason, on that not Papa Legba guy. Why would Fiona suddenly be interested in that? Well, who knows, because it's just what the script wanted to do at the moment, I guess. It made absolutely no sense that they introduced that part of the narrative without ever really going to the next step on it. Correct that. Let's have some sexy demons or something. Don't spend a lot of time in flashbacks or back-building a story. Flashbacks are the bane of my existence. If you cannot tell a story without resorting to flashbacks extensively, maybe you should rethink how you're presenting your story. Don't try and back-build a story that we should be able to intuitively or fairly simply understand from the circumstances. You don't need to. And flashbacks to try and tie it into previous series just seemed contrived, usually embarrassing, and almost always awful. Hotel is one of the best examples in terms of a season where flashbacks, back-building, and callbacks are horrible. Don't do it. Just don't do it. Don't remind us of when the show was better. Don't remind us of when it had characters we cared about. Don't remind us of when plotting was even better, especially if you can't manage to pull it off this time. Callbacks only do so much, and they're not going to be able to keep an audience when you can't do that anyway. If you don't have them there, if they're not there for it, not all the callbacks, flashbacks, or back-building in the world are going to sit their asses down and make them go, yeah, this is a good show. Avoid it if we can. I don't want flashbacks. Do streamline the story. It's fine if you have episodic things for them to deal with. That's what they should do anyway. You should be able to take any episode, sit down, generally get the gist of what's going on, have at least some problem, and have it be resolved by the end of the episode. There are very few episodes per season in American Horror Story, and they seem to be getting fewer and fewer with every season that passes by. I would like to sit down at any time and watch any singular episode and be able to enjoy it. That being said, there can be connecting threads, but as it gets more complicated, your writers, who are not the best writers in the world anyway, have more complications that they have to deal with, or have to ignore and have people like me point out that they ignored them, let them slide, or never dealt with them at all. Don't do this. Streamline the basic story, have a point A and a point B, and have several points that they can touch upon on the way from one to the other. Don't overcomplicate things to the point where people have trouble remembering why this even happened and what relevance this has in terms of how it relates to the main plot. The cool thing about, say, Murder House was that it was very coherent and pretty much everything and everyone had something to do with the house, the main plot, and the main characters. It was also satisfying because it was coherent and ended up being more fulfilling by the fact that there was an actual plot arc that involved everybody, and though there were individual episodic things that came up and were usually resolved in that episode or within a couple of episodes, the story was not overly complicated, and you could basically get the gist of what was going on any episode you tuned in on. You didn't have to watch it from episode 1 to the end, but it was more satisfying if you did. Coven is one of those seasons that just completely falls apart by the end, and it's so confusing because it's fundamentally a very simple concept. They just kept not committing to things, and, well, You'd think that something was the main plot, and it wasn't, in fact. It ends up in what I call a wet fart resolution, where nothing is particularly satisfying or fulfilling, it's not really very dramatic, and it ends up being disappointing. Let's keep it streamlined and simple enough. Even if you do quote-unquote monster of the week type stuff, keep the central overarching plot simple enough so that it can be satisfying. Don't try and make this a finale where everyone ends up killed off, like Coven. Although there are barely any characters even left over by the end of Coven, which is funny since ghosts in the previous series were so prevalent and so very present, and resurrection was basically the easiest thing in the world in Coven. They kind of mess things up considerably by the end, just to say the least. I know it's called Apocalypse, but let's not get rid of all of our characters, please. We don't want to see that. Nobody's tuning in for that. Nobody is going to be invested enough to care if you do that. Have characters that we can invest in who are going to stick around so that we can follow them in the plot. Have it be interesting, because witches are one of the few characters in the American Horror Story universe that actually have some ability to have agency. That's why I want them to have agency so much. They actually use magic, they have powers, they can do things. They are among the few characters that actually have that ability. They should be special in the setting, so don't make them less special by making them seem to be disposable. That would be a mistake, and that was one of your greatest mistakes in having Queenie cameo in Hotel. It doesn't satisfy, it makes no narrative sense, and nobody enjoyed it. Do show restraint and elegance, instead of shoehorning in buzzwords and now issues. Ryan Murphy is not a particularly nuanced, subtle, or, good writer. I really would like it if he would stop trying to inject issues into a basically stupid primetime horror series that really don't belong there. Many of them will make every episode that they appear in instantly dated. Usually he doesn't handle them in a good way, and most of the time it's kind of embarrassing to see him try. It tends to be wasted effort from the actors, the directors, the writers, though they don't do it very well, and it would be overall so much better if they just didn't have that in a season. Cult should have kind of taught the lesson. Maybe you shouldn't try and deal with things that are way beyond the complexity level of your production crew's ability to handle. Keep it elegant, keep it at the level of an older horror film, something that we can enjoy but with a modern twist. You don't get that modern twist by artificially shoehorning in things that have no business really being there. We look to fantasy, sometimes, admittedly, to examine things, problems in modern life, but dark fantasy especially, and especially where it blends with horror, we usually look to as an escape. We look to it to escape, to go through this ordeal and come out stronger and be able to become victorious over this ordeal. In the face of adversity, we look to horror to transcend that adversity. We don't need anything else. We certainly don't need dated references and awkward shoehorning of things that are handled better elsewhere and more appropriate for the genre and the story. Don't give us another bullshit ending. Learn from your mistakes with the previous seasons. Most seasons of American Horror Story have terrible finales. People will tune in out of morbid curiosity about how bad they'll be, and they are terrible. There has not been one that has been wholly, entirely satisfying. Murder Houses was good enough for me, but I can imagine that there were plenty of people that weren't too delighted by it. It was okay. In comparison to the other seasons, it was a masterpiece. While I was preparing for this video today, I found a headline online, an article, that said that Coven's finale was, and I quote, bullshit. And I can't disagree. It was pretty bullshit. So don't do that. Don't do that. Give us a satisfying ending. Give us something appropriate for the series. And, if you want to make this the last in that, universe or whatever and do something fresh and new next time, cool. That doesn't mean you have to finish off everything and try and neatly tie up everything, because mark my words, you will do it badly. Just leave well enough alone, leave the resolution well enough alone, and do something that is dignified. Leave it with some dignity, and let the sun set on that setting if that's what you want to do. But for fuck's sake, don't give us another crap ending. And on that note, do give viewers an open resolution so that they can invest themselves directly into the world. Encourage fan stuff. That's the stuff that keeps series alive. That's what keeps people watching, too. Give them something where it's easy for them to insert themselves into this world in their fantasy. Give them the implements by which they can do that. Let them play in your sandbox. Set up this sandbox and then say, it's yours now. Even if this may be a world that is facing the apocalypse in American Horror Story Apocalypse, it can be a viable setting. I'm reminded of the White Wolf World of Darkness that was so popular in the 90s and which I played a lot of at the time. It was a world facing what everybody assumed was the end times, but it was no less compelling for that. It was actually even more compelling at the possibility that that's what it could be. That's the way you can handle this. You don't have to be heavy-handed or obvious. You can be fairly elegant and hands-off and light in your address of it. Do I think that's what'll happen? Probably not. But I can hope. And I hope these points have given you all something to think about. We'll know when the series starts what we can look forward to, and I hope it'll be at least better than the previous years that we've had. I'm still hopeful that this will manage an 11th hour turnaround, something worth seeing, worth watching, and worth thinking of the American Horror Story name in a positive light, for once in a very long time. I hope you've enjoyed your time with me here today. I've got plenty of links in the blurb for you to follow if you're interested in what I do, and if you like what I do, please do feel free to follow me on Patreon, become a patron if you like. Plenty of bonuses and extra fun stuff, and I really do appreciate all the help. It's been a kind of a year, and I really do appreciate any support you can give. Well, I will see you next time. Have a good one, and thanks again for spending time with me. You're welcome. Bye.